Welcome back to another episode of the Big Apples CoRe podcast. I'm Patrick Steffens from Avis & Young, joined today by Molly Dee-Ramasamy from JB&B Engineering.
Hey there.
Thanks for coming today. We are enjoying this lovely day at the top of Central Park at the Steelcase showroom. And Molly, just want to give a little background from the users. Your role currently is you're the director of the Deep Carbon Reduction Group at JB&B.
Yep.
Can you give a little background as to what that is? You know, deep carbon, think, sci-fi movies and stuff like that. But
Yeah, happy to do it and happy to be here. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, so the director of the Deep Carbon Reduction Group at JB&B, our group is about deep carbon reduction, right? The industry is headed towards a decarbonized future, and at JB&B, we've invested in the idea that decarbonization needs to be significant, right? We're moving beyond the days of energy efficiency and those, as we call them, sort of shallow reductions, still very important and still something that everybody needs to pursue, but as we're facing things like Local Law 97 and Local Law 154, there's certainly a desire for deeper levels of decarbonization, and that goes into transitioning MEP systems over from what we have today in existing buildings over to low carbon electrified systems in the future. So to give a little more background on myself and just the group in general, I've been with JB&B and in this industry for almost about 10 years now. I started in our field operations group at JB&B, so I started my career actually, in active construction sites, boots on the ground, doing the work alongside operations teams, construction teams, and design teams for both new and existing buildings. So I got to see the real-world considerations associated with real estate.
primarily office or different product types?
Across the board. Class A, commercial real estate, hospital and healthcare, life science, you name it. I've been in it. So started out there, and then around 2018 shifted over to energy and carbon. JB&B decided the industry was headed in this direction, kind of saw the writing on the wall. And so I've been doing this full time now for a couple years, and we've grown substantially. I mean, we went from 2 people, myself and one other individual over at JB&B, to 16 people. And I think that is representative of the desire in the industry for more of these deep decarbonization type projects.
And I think part of that desire comes from the quote unquote less educated real estate folks like myself who understand that some of these buildings are really inefficient and have a ton of room for improvement. And combination of that with groups like JB&B who are kind of ahead of that curve and started this team a couple of years ago, giving you guys a leg up on competition-wise and into some sort of ways to, kind of help grow your team and your business and create a name for yourself. So thanks so much for being here. Thanks for that background. You did touch on 2 topics, one of which I'm semi-familiar with, Local Law 97. And you mentioned another local law that you're ready to throw my brain for a pretzel. But can you give us a little background about how New York City and New York City buildings specifically are being impacted by this new legislation?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with Local Law 97. That's the one that's kind of been in the news for some time now. But Local Law 97 is New York City's carbon cap law. So it actually caps carbon on existing buildings 25,000 square feet or larger, which is quite a bit of the city here.
New York? Come on, there's millions and hundreds of millions of square feet here. It's got to be everything.
It's just about everything. So it's truly is a landmark piece of legislation, and I think when it sort of hit the road in 2019, it really shocked the industry. Definitely, it sort of is a stick. A lot of people think of it as a stick because Local Law 97 comes with financial penalties, right? So a building is given an allowable carbon cap, and that carbon cap actually gets more stringent every 5 years. And if you're above your given carbon cap, you're subject to a fine of $268 per ton that you're over that fine. So to put that in perspective, right, because that's just, sort of a random number, 2030, which is the second compliance period for Local Law 97, where a lot of people are kind of, having to do something to get into compliance. The average penalty is about $1 per square foot. right? So you think about some of the really big buildings we have in the city here, $1 per square foot is not insignificant. So that's, kind of the short overview of Local Law 97.
With office rents ranging at 60, and the cost to operate the building is somewhere between 15 and 25, and taxes are another 15 to 25. Adding additional fines and penalties as it relates to the building is impacting either the bottom line of the landlord receiving less money in rent, or the bottom line of the tenant having to pay more to cover it.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a trend that is here to stay.
Oh, yeah.
And smart landlords and smart tenants have already begun taking advantage of some ways to, make themselves better than their competition in terms of energy consumption. Can you provide an idea or a strategy that some of these landlords can do to help clean up their output?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the important things to remember about Local Law 97 specifically is that it's about carbon, right? The industry is used to energy, thinking about things in terms of energy or energy use intensity, right, which is how much energy is being used per square foot. Here we've shifted metrics and we're talking about carbon. And it's important because there's some integration and some thought that needs to happen around the components of the utility, the grid specifically. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit later on. But in terms of general strategy for Local Law 97, and I think just preparing for the future in general, I like to say the overarching strategy for everybody, new and existing buildings, should be reduce, recycle, electrify. Right, so 3-step process here. The first step is reduce. That's your typical energy efficiency stuff, right? The stuff that the industry is used to. A lot of folks have probably already undertaken a lot of energy efficiency type projects. Keep doing that. It's really important.
Is that stuff like LED bulbs?
Yes,
and,
yes, exactly.
Cleaning up your outlets and your, the old cabling that's kind of just spewing out. And
Yeah.
not so much capped and controlling its output. Okay, I see it.
Yep.
And
Lighting, operational control stuff, if you have a building management system, appliances, things of that nature. Easy stuff, fast turnaround, low disruption, fast payback. That's energy efficiency in that first bucket with reduce. Then if we go on to the second, recycle, right? There's this new sort of movement around recycling or recovering heat from within buildings. And this one is newer, right? We already do some of this a little bit in the industry, but more and more focus is putting on this idea of not letting a single unit of energy escape the building without reusing it. So that's the next step, and that's things like water side heat recovery, air side heat recovery, and then last but not least, electrify, right? And that's, we're talking about electrifying heating systems in buildings. Most buildings right now probably have some sort of fossil fuel-based heating system. Could be a boiler, furnace, right? A lot of buildings are using district steam. We want to eventually transition those over as much as we can to electrified systems. And that's what Local Law 97 is really about at the end of the day. It's about pushing existing buildings toward this low-carbon electrified future.
Low-carbon electrified future. It's definitely, I believe, something that's, we have to head that direction, right, for the sake of the planet and the environment and the city and generations to come. But you said it's, this is not just reward your future generations with what's around. This is a stick. There's a penalty coming. And some of these landlords that aren't yet in compliance are going through some of these reduce, recycle, electrify measures. We mentioned some of the strategies of an existing building, right? Are there strategies of a new building? Is it a different level of glass on the windows? Is it a different level of, facade to keep carbon inside the building? Is it, different ways you can run your or design a brand new elevator system that it's not constantly churning and burning all this extra power?
Yeah, there are definitely some core strategies for new construction, and I would say that electrification in general, it's much easier in new construction. There are a lot of constraints with existing buildings that, pose serious challenges to electrifying systems in existing buildings. But new construction, right, you're starting from scratch in theory, so you have a lot more flexibility. And some of those core strategies are things like low temperature hot water systems, right? Instead of operating building temperatures, On the hot water side at 140 to 180, you're down low in the 90 to 100 degree range. And what that allows you to do is use heat pump technology. And in the city here, primarily we're talking about air source heat pumps. If you go into other areas, you might be talking about ground source heat pumps, water source heat pumps. There's a couple different flavors here. But those are the core strategies, right? You're still going to use that reduce, recycle, electrify process. That works for everybody. Works for existing buildings and new buildings. But then when you start to really look at those new building systems, we want to be designing for low temp hot water and air source heat pumps if you're in a dense urban area, most likely.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, right? When you're developing a new building, you're not just designing it for the occupants today. You're designing it for the occupants tomorrow. And similar to how some of these buildings that we're talking about that need to get refurbished and reduce were buildings that were built 100 years ago. I mean, New York is, by American standards, an old city.
Yep.
Are there certain advantages or disadvantages between, like a turn of the century building, a 1960s to 80s building versus, something that's even just 10 years old that probably doesn't fit?
Interestingly enough, it really just depends, right? There's a saying that every building is a unique snowflake, and that's absolutely true, especially in a place here like, New York City, where we have a really robust real estate industry, right? There's a large concentration of world-class architects, builders and designers, right? We have a super iconic skyline in addition to having some very, very old buildings. And so when you start to look at Local Law 97 compliance, right, or even just kind of looking in general at sustainability and decarbonization in buildings, what you realize very quickly is that, each has its pros and its cons when it comes to energy and carbon. And there's really no sort of like easy rules of thumb to say, okay, this kind of building for sure is going to have a problem in 2030 versus this building is going to be fine. I would say, newer construction that is focused really heavily on sustainability, in these last, call it 5-10 years, probably going to be in a better place just because of that sustainability focus. But yeah, it really depends.
So one of the things I just got out of that part was that every building has to be making some sort of advancement, and you can't just rest on your laurels. And a building that was top of the line and top quality even 10 years ago is no longer going to be, the new kid on the block, the top tier trophy asset like it once was. And part of that is to maintain, from a landlord's point of view, maintain the highest rents. Part of that is to maintain the most desirable asset for tenants, whether that's office, retail, industrial, or multifamily, like apartment tenants. And everybody has to be making some sort of adjustments and changes to get to this. So it's not something that one of these laws that only applies to office buildings, or one of these laws that only applies to apartment buildings and people don't have to worry about. I laughed in my head when you had mentioned water temperatures. Not thinking about, my primary business is an office space. There's not a lot of saunas and not a lot of showers in office spaces where you need super hot water. You need it in kitchens. You need it in apartments. You need it in some other places. So I'm opening my brain towards, this is a problem for everybody, but a problem not insurmountable. There's people like you out there trying to solve these issues and work with buildings on strategies like this each and every day.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to highlight, that everybody does have a role to play here. And it's not just those who own buildings or operate buildings, it's also end users, right? We all are contributing to a building's carbon emissions profile or energy profile. And so in general, just sort of recognizing that every choice we make as somebody in a building is also impactful, and that this is a problem for everybody that we want to solve together. So there are service providers out there like myself who do this all day long and are super passionate about it. But it's not just us. It's really everybody who's got to come together to participate to make this happen, because the goals are pretty staggering and, as you mentioned, critically important to the future. But, when we think about New York State has a goal of being effectively carbon neutral by 2050 for the entire economy, right? That's huge. And then the city
That's
as
not
well.
just buildings. That's
everything.
You blame it.
Yeah, that is everything. And then here in New York City, we're also working towards, I think it's an 85% reduction in carbon emissions citywide by 2050. So these are our deep decarbonization requirements that we're looking at that we want to try to achieve. So there's a lot of work to be done.
I think you brought up a really great point. You know, part of where I was going prior to what you just mentioned was it's on the landlord's dime. It's on the landlord to reduce, recycle, and electrify. But it's not just that. It's the occupants. It's the tenants. It's the person who's living in that apartment. Turn your lights off when you leave. It's, you know, you're in the office space. Put timers on the lights that if, you know, nobody's around on that fourth floor for half of the day, the lights don't need to be on and flashing. Yeah. Tenants are just as responsible. And I think, you know I'm seeing in leases is landlords don't want to be responsible for everything as it relates to this because it's part of it is the tenant's practice or occupancy is going to raise the level of carbon and level of activity within the building versus another tenant. So I feel like it's a topic we all have to tackle.
Definitely.
You know, you mentioned and you study a lot of all these strategies when you're designing a space, when you're designing a building. You know, and I just thought of a couple of things that you and I can do in our apartment. So is there something that you and I may not be thinking of on a regular day-to-day basis to make our carbon footprint a little lighter within our regular office, apartment, or, you know, store experience, shopping?
Yeah, I mean, most likely. At the end of the day, there are a million little opportunities that, you know, you can undertake for a space or even for yourself as an individual. And when we start talking about individuals and their, you know, specific carbon contribution, we start to kind of stray into a different area of carbon. You know, Local Law 97 is a building law about operational carbon, but then there are other components of carbon to consider as well, right? There are embodied carbon elements that we need to be thinking about. And then, you know, as I was mentioning before, this kind of scope 3 personal contribution where you can calculate your individual footprint, which is actually incredibly difficult to do. But what's interesting is that in general, we are seeing that this is becoming more and more of a request and a requirement, not just within the building sector, but in other sectors as well. So to answer your question directly, like, you know, what can we do? I would say in offices, right, or even in retail spaces, always lighting is a great place to start. Also setbacks and set points, right? So for example, you mentioned turning the lights off when people aren't around. You can schedule something like that, right? Set point resets are when you have, I don't know, let's say you're trying to cool a space to a certain comfortable temperature, but if people aren't physically in the space, do you necessarily need to do that much cooling? You can set back that set point to not use so much energy, which then, you know, translates to less carbon as well. So it's those kind of easy to implement strategies that people can undertake very easily, even without necessarily the help of a consultant coming in and putting together a 30-year plan.
And that's where your typical engagements are, right? Is these large occupiers or these large landlords will come to you, and you're not there to help them just in the immediate near future. It's you're planning out for the long term.
Yes, very much so. And that's what I think is a really exciting and interesting, but also very challenging part of my role and what other folks that, you know, do this work are contending with, because there's a lot of risk right now in the industry, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. And with that uncertainty comes more risk. And so what we need to do is make sure we understand the landscape of what's going on, not just in real estate, not just in, you know, the AEC industry, but also the power sector, the policy environment, right? There's a lot more now that we need to be aware of and educated on so that we can plan effectively for that 30-year time horizon. I mean, if you think about it, what was the world like 30 years ago? It's nothing like it is now. And so we have to try to think ahead. Okay, what we're seeing now, what do we think that's going to translate to way down the line? And how do we help our clients mitigate the risk associated with that time horizon?
So part of that risk, you think about, if there's this broad scope and direction towards, you know, reduce, recycle, and then electrify. Mm-hmm. If everybody's working towards more electrify and less of the coal or heat or old school oil and gas boilers, right? electrify, electrify, electrify. From New York City, all of the electric comes from Con Edison. Con Ed's got their substations that provide the electric power through the city. I learned a little bit of high school physics that I know that the power's got to come on a full circuit, but there's only so much power depending on how much battery or how much the original source is. Can Con Ed support if the whole city's moving everything towards electric?
So, couple points there, because it's a tough question to answer, and I think you have to kind of consider a couple different things before I answer
Please
yes
do.
or no.
Talk to me like I'm 6.
Well, the first thing to realize is that not everybody can or will electrify all at once. And that's really important because there is this feeling that if everybody today took all the loads that were currently on fossil fuels for heating systems and flipped them over to electric, Con Edison wouldn't be able to support it. It'd be crazy, right? We would break the grid. There's that feeling that could very much be true. But, right, we have to remember not everybody can or will electrify, and they certainly won't do it at the same time, right? So we're looking at a much more phased, sort of stretched out timeline in which people are going to be doing this kind of work. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there are smart ways to electrify, purposeful ways, we'll call them, and less purposeful ways to electrify. You could very well take all of those loads, not do any energy efficiency, and put it on electric resistance. That would be really bad, right? But on the other hand, what service providers are more likely to do and should be recommending is to do that reduce, recycle, get the loads in buildings down as low as they can, and then electrify, right? So you're fundamentally electrifying a much smaller load, and you're doing it with heat pump technology. So this is not your toaster, this is not electric resistance. This is heat pump technology, which is super efficient as compared to some of these other methods, right? So that's the second point. And then the final point is that we do have some data on this. The Urban Green Council recently released a report that really kind of did a substation by substation evaluation of how much headroom there is on the electric grid to support electrification. And I think their finding was that we have about a good 10 years before we're actually at a point where our grid would go from what's called a summer peaking grid to a winter peaking grid. And all that means is right now our grid is sized for the peak summer, right? It's when it's the hottest, it's when everybody's running their AC. That's what the system is sized to accommodate. Because we're electrifying heating loads, we're actually adding load in a season that is much lower than the summer season. So we have room. And I think the number they came up with on that report was somewhere around 40%, before we start to see that switch between summer and winter peak.
Aha, there, light bulb moment. Most of New York is cooled by plugging in your air conditioner.
That's right, yep.
Most of New York is heated by an old building system that comes from a basement furnace or boiler or some sort of coal or gas source creates the carbon.
Mm-hmm.
Just turning the heat source towards more electric heat sources is not so much interfering, because you're not running your air conditioner and your heater at the same time. So it's not so much interfering with that peak that we would see in the rare occasion of a summer blackout because of everybody's ACs running too high.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Light bulb.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's one of those topics that, like I said, it just kind of, it feels a certain way, like, ooh, I don't know if we could do that all at once, but those three considerations, certainly put me at ease. I think they put a lot of other people at ease in terms of thinking about the grid and what is going to be capable of, supporting in the future. It's also worth noting that obviously Con Edison and other entities like this, they're planning for this future, this decarbonized future. You can read their long-range plans for electric, for steam, for the utilities across the board. And you see, I mean, there's a lot of money that's going to be invested into our electric system, in the coming 10 years to prepare for this low-carbon future. Now, of course, that's, sort of a polarizing topic because more investment means more cost for ratepayers. But at the end of the day, right, it's we have an old system to begin with, to your point, and these upgrades are inevitable. So at least we're going to be upgrading them for a low-carbon future.
On that mode of low-carbon future, decarbonization, right? Those are the big buzzwords, Clearly, this is something you've spent a lot of time. Your career is focused on it. Can you walk us back a little bit as to what brought you here? Was it you knew you were thinking you were seeing the trend lines when you were at your early stages on boots on the ground at JB&B, and you said, hey, maybe I can make my mark here, or is it a point of passion, or how did you end up focused in this route?
Yeah, that's a good question. I definitely didn't anticipate ending up here. I didn't necessarily go to school for renewable energy or energy systems.
You
right?
mean in third grade you didn't want to? When I grow up, I'm gonna
decarbonize buildings and 30-year time horizons. No, I was not anticipating that. I did my degree in mechanical engineering, and for a while I was focused on product design. And then when I moved to New York, I started with JB&B, and I discovered the building industry. And I have to say, I think it's just so interesting and multifaceted and complex. And I really enjoyed my time in the field, with the field group, because I got to see sort of the nuts and bolts of how things in the city get built. And when you look at these buildings, they're amazing, right? And it's amazing that so many people come together to build them.
Not just people, different trades and different
absolutely
different companies, different. Somebody can be building the superstructure at the same time somebody else is installing windows on a lower floor. At the same time, somebody's doing plumbing and electric on a lower floor, and there, you can count. There's 40 or 50 different trade groups, and depending on the size of the building.
Absolutely, and then if you do your job right, at least in the case of an MEP engineer, nobody notices what you did, right? If it's a perfectly comfortable and great indoor environment, and everybody's cool and comfortable, then you did a great job, and nobody even knows you were there. So
that's some really sexy ductwork over there.
I'm the only person, right, who notices in my family when a diffuser doesn't look quite right or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I discovered buildings. I think buildings are fantastic. And then, truth be told, this new policy landscape really started to come into focus in 2018 and 2019. And I just got really interested in how it was going to shift and disrupt the industry. And it wasn't always clear if it would be a positive or a negative disruption. And so I think just naturally, because of my curiosity and interest in people and how they would anticipate and react to this kind of new initiative, led me to do this work. And as I've gotten into it more and more, I just think it's more and more interesting, fascinating, really, and especially to learn about more than just building systems, which is where I started. Now I'm learning about real estate, about the power sector, about policy making at the city and state level. It's just a much more complex and interconnected set of skills and knowledge, and personally I really enjoy that growth.
That's great. I mean, we thank you. Your insights to not just me here today, but everybody who's listening, I'm sure somebody's going to pick up something they didn't already know.
I hope so.
Now, on this thread and theme and goal of decarbonization, something that comes to mind, point me in the right direction. Carbon credits. Buildings can purchase or set themselves up with renewable sources outside of the physical plant of their building that offsets their current output at the building. Is that something that is an approved and a okay to thumbs up route, or is it, you think, more of a short-term stopgap type of situation?
Well, so what you're referring to here are effectively renewable energy credits, and it's a little bit nuanced, so I'll kind of dig into it a little bit here. So, for Local Law 97 compliance, there's absolutely a pathway, right, to procure renewable energy credits. They do have to be a specific designation, and I know some folks in the industry, this will, be something they recognize as a term here. Tier 4 renewable energy credits are what are allowable for Local Law 97. The good news for those of you out there who kind of have been tracking this is that the contracts were recently inked with New York State to actually build the Tier 4 projects that were in the pipeline. That's high voltage DC lines, bringing in Canadian hydro and upstate hydro. So that's great news. I think that is really encouraging, and that will be a shorter term stopgap measure for hopefully a lot of folks. In the long term, however, the whole New York State grid is supposed to decarbonize, meaning that at some point in the future, theoretically 2040, is what the state is shooting for, all electricity will be carbon free, right? Either it will come from renewable resources or it will come from things like hydro. And so they won't, those things won't have a carbon content associated with them, and buildings can use them freely, and that's why electrified buildings in the long term make a lot of sense. And the trick is to transition buildings alongside that grid transition so that, our buildings are electrified and carbon free. But yeah, I mean, the point is, at some point, hopefully 2040, you won't have to kind of keep things as a stopgap measure and procure those credits separately. Our grid will just be renewable.
2040, that was the New York State goal, right?
Yep.
Okay.
With a 70% target for 2030, which, if you think about it, is right around the corner.
That's you're building now for 2030. So
yeah,
part of that power grid and trying to get the grid towards that carbon neutral, the green grid is something that is the phrase is thrown around in the media every once in a while. Part of that is going to be on the occupants, and part of that's going to be on the landlords to clean up their act. Not to go too far out of the weeds here, into the weeds. Too far into the weeds here. Are there some sort of measures that you and your team can work with with the grid providers and the Con Ed to try and clean up their act? Is that something that you guys typically get involved with?
Well, I mean, I would say the planning, on the side of Con Ed and just in general the state level initiatives, they have whole groups, right, that are dedicated to thinking through that and planning for that. And, much of the analysis that's going into the creation of these goals has been done years in the past, believe it or not. So, I mean, sure, as a service provider, as somebody who works with building owners and users, sometimes we're asked to participate in things like working groups or, sort of like feedback sessions to make sure that whatever is coming down the pipeline in terms of programs to support electrification and decarbonization kind of in the right direction for end users, I would say those groups don't necessarily need us.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of true with, on my role is the office occupancy, right? The government has their own teams to do this type of thing, but every once in a while they'll engage myself or a competitor on thought. And because, we see things from a different side. We see things, they're stuck in sometimes, sorry to the government here, sometimes they're stuck in their own bubble too much. And, sometimes that outside perspective is helpful. And I know that's how we've gotten involved with certain groups like that. And, I'm sure your work with speaking panels and with other thought leaders and how this podcast is going to help somebody somewhere, on that side.
Yeah. I try to participate as much as I can because, like we said, everybody's got a part to play. And so to your point, we see things from that end user perspective and obviously from the design perspective where we're trying to figure out how these systems are going to work and what we can rely on and what kind of assumptions we should make. So yeah, I mean, speaking panels, I've been on a number of working groups and advisory committees. I think the public-private partnership is really critical to the overall success. So totally agree.
Right on. Thanks so much. Before we take off, one of our favorite things to hit the guests with on their way out the door is a quick little rapid fire.
Cool.
We're a New York-centered real estate podcast.
Yeah.
What's your favorite way to get around the city?
Probably biking.
Your own bike, city bike?
My own bike. Yeah, I used to commute into work actually on my bike. These days I live in Jersey. I know, I'm sorry. But I still enjoy riding my bike in the city when I can.
I do it too. I love it. It's the fastest way to get around.
For sure.
You go back to talk to your 18-year-old self that didn't want to grow up to be a decarbon reduction expert. You could tell that person one thing. What are you telling them?
I would probably tell my 18-year-old self that of all the skills, right, that you can learn and perfect, the most important one is probably communication. Being in an engineering field, you would think that being super, super technical all the time is the most important thing. And don't get me wrong, it's, critically important. But honestly, getting those ideas across and being able to communicate them to different kinds of audiences, I think, is really powerful. So I would tell myself that.
That's deep. I like that. It's not just knowing the thought. It's how you can communicate it. And what I thought was very interesting was different groups of people, because the way you can teach somebody is different than the way you're going to teach somebody else. What's your favorite lunch spot?
My favorite lunch spot, that's probably impossible to actually choose a favorite spot. There's just so much good stuff in the city that I would say it depends on what I'm in the mood for.
Pizza or bagels?
Oh, pizza or bagels? Still, I don't know. There's still too many places that you could have delightful pizza or bagels.
You can pick one, pizza or bagels.
As like my favorite food?
No,
where
one or the other, not of everything.
Between the two, pizza.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, hot soup. What was your favorite interesting news article?
Recently, well, let's see. I mentioned the Tier 4 contracts being signed. That was pretty exciting for me. I know that's nerdy, but when I saw that, I was pretty happy. There was also recently in the news a bill passed in the New York State Senate, Senate Bill 9422, which is about utility thermal energy networks. If anybody wants to check that out, also enthralling.
Please give me a little detail on thermal energy networks.
Wow, thermal energy networks are super cool. Basically, it's this idea that you can have shared loops, shared water loops across buildings that can take ambient water and then use it for heating and cooling purposes. So sort of like a district approach. But in the past, it's been difficult for utilities to actually install these types of systems, even though they could be incredibly efficient and helpful for decarbonization. So this new Senate bill, granted, it hasn't been signed by the governor yet, but at least it's headed there. It made it through the Senate and the Assembly. It would allow utilities to do more of that kind of work. So I think that's cool. That's the kind of thing I read in the news. Yeah.
That sounds like a topic for a whole nother podcast.
It totally could be.
I think you got my brain going on a couple other questions, but we are out of time. I really appreciate you being here today and enlightening me and helping out some of the listeners today.
It was my pleasure.
Molly, thanks so much.
Thank you.